Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. It will take more than $4 trillion to fix ailing, aging infrastructure in the United States to bring it back up to a state of good repair. Decades of neglect or minimal patchwork have taken a toll on thousands of bridges, roads, pipelines, and transport systems across the land.
And I'm Malika Bilal. Are your eyes glazing over, getting bored? Well, think about this. Failing infrastructure has real effects on ordinary people. It could lead to rising food prices, your job could be at risk, and it may even be bad for your health. Today, we'll take a look at the economic impact of the rising infrastructure cost and examine who's most affected.
We will rebuild our country with American workers, American iron, American aluminum, American steel. We will create millions of new jobs and make millions of American dreams come true. Our infrastructure will again be the best in the world. We used to have the greatest infrastructure anywhere in the world. And today we're like a third world country. We are literally like a third world country. Our infrastructure will again be the best. And we will restore the pride in our communities, our nation. And all over the United States, we'll be proud again.
So just how bad is infrastructure in the United States? The American Society of Civil Engineers recently gave the US an overall grade of a D+, a rating considered poor and at risk, just one step above unfit for purpose. Joining us on our set to talk about this, Tom Smith, Executive Director of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Sitting right next to him, Tanvi Misra, staff writer at City Lab, covering demographics, inequality and urban culture.
Barry Lipatner is author of Too Big to Fall, America's Failing Infrastructure and the Way Forward. He's also a construction lawyer. And John Nichols is political correspondent for The Nation magazine and author of Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse. Welcome to the stream, everyone. I want to get started on my laptop with the pitch from our community member. This is Brandon Thompson, who wrote in on Facebook. He wants us to cover the crumbling American infrastructure. So we took that pitch and went to our community and asked them to send us examples of what that looks like in their homes. This is a tweet we got from Angeles in North Carolina, and she shared this. This is her walk to school. You can see pretty crumbling sidewalks. They're in bad shape, and she says it's particularly dangerous at night where they're not lit, and you can't really tell where you're going, and especially dangerous if you have a disability. Tom, what can sidewalks tell us about the state of a city? Is this one of the things that you grade?
Oh, absolutely. We look at surface transportation, so we look at roads, bridges, transit. And, you know, sidewalks are indicative of the problems that we have. We have failed to invest, and much of our infrastructure is at the end of its useful life. And much of it was constructed before I was born, and I'm in my 50s, I'll tell you. So, it's an issue.
We believe you. I want to give people a sense of this infrastructure and the state it's in via Barry. Barry has a website called Save Our Bridges. Barry, I'm going to show it here on my laptop. You explain what it is. What does it do?
Well, this website was created by me on the 5th anniversary after the August 1, 2007 collapse of the I-35W bridge in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which killed 13 people and injured 145 people. It was the worst tragedy that we've had in our infrastructure world to date. And what I did was decide that because our politicians were not really addressing the problem in a serious way, was to begin a grassroots, upstart focus by showing anyone in the country can put in their zip code and can identify the dangerous bridges that existed in and around their communities or their relatives' communities around the country. And these are the bridges that are both structurally deficient, of which there are about 60,000, and also fracture critical, which means they have no ability to withstand a collapse if one piece breaks. That was the I-35W, as well as numerous others that have been in the news.
All right, so everybody, what you're looking at right now, these are these critical bridges in the New York area. Tanvi, let me type in your zip code or your state.
20010.
20010. Oh, we live next door to each other. Let me just
I tell you, I drove across one of those bridges on my way here today. So
This is Washington, D.C.
Fracture critical, structurally deficient.
Wow. Okay, so Washington, D.C. You live in the Washington, D.C. area. These are all the bridges that you probably, what, Barry, should be avoiding? We should be avoiding?
Should be avoiding, because at any moment, according to every structural bridge engineer I've ever talked to, and I've talked to hundreds of them, a bridge that has those conditions, structurally deficient plus fracture critical, can collapse at a moment's notice. And as they tell me, not me as the source, as the bridge engineers say, without the redundancy, without our commitment to add structural integrity to these bridges, sooner or later, every one of these nearly 8,000 bridges has the capacity to collapse.
Tom, this is deeply disturbing, frightening, terrifying. Anybody in America right now is looking at saveourbridges.com.
Yeah, so the structurally deficient bridges do have a structural defect. They get added attention, so they're going to get inspections at least every year. They're on a list that's maintained by Department of Transportation's. The fracture critical component that Barry referenced also means that it doesn't have redundancy. So one member could cause the bridge to fail, as I-35 did. So they are getting added focus. Of course, I drove across the bridge, as I just referenced today. So it's one of these things, as we prioritize our infrastructure, we need to keep that in consideration.
Let me just show you something here we had from one of our online community, Jeff, and he explains the power sector remains one of Nigeria's greatest infrastructure challenges, with extremely limited electricity across the country. And then we're looking at the US of having a D+ grade, John. So the president is saying the infrastructure is a developing world infrastructure that we have right now in the US. How did we get here? Because the US used to be right at the top of the list of the best infrastructure in the world.
Well, historically, the United States spent a lot of money on infrastructure. It poured money into infrastructure programs, which often weren't understood as such. They were, in the 1930s, understood as jobs programs. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, many of the other initiatives of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Similarly, in the 1950s, the highway program, which built our interstate highways, was very politically popular. It was encouraged by President Dwight Eisenhower, but he actually sold it in many cases as a national security initiative. So the truth of the matter is that the United States has often in the past invested in infrastructure, but not always understood it as such. Now we have a new debate, and that new debate is caused not merely by the desire to create jobs, although that is a part of it, as the president focuses on, and not merely because infrastructure does relate to national defense, but because we have allowed a crumbling of infrastructure at the state and federal levels because we want to spend the money elsewhere. And this is just a simple reality. Politically, infrastructure was not a hot item. It wasn't at the top of the list. It wasn't even number 10 on the list when politicians started talking about it.
Where was it? On the list of 1 to 10, where was it? Was it on the list?
It was probably about 20. It was around 20. And maybe my fellow guests
26.
would agree.
Okay. How low can we go?
Well, but this is the problem. And I will say, I am not a fan of Donald Trump. I'm quite a critic of the guy. But if he hadn't forced it into the debate in 2016, it wouldn't have been a part of the debate. It's not that Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders wouldn't have talked about it. The fact of the matter is, if you're going to have a discussion about infrastructure, you have to talk about it all the time. It has to be a regular part of the discourse, and there has to be a lot of education with it.
Well, John
I
is
think in the United States now, we're going to see some infrastructure investment.
Well, John is very correct. For several decades now, our nation has lacked political will and political leadership to address this issue. The investment percentage of what we are spending now is at an all-time low. Compare this. China is now spending 9% of its GDP on infrastructure building. In India, they're spending over 5%. In the United States, we are spending less than 2% of GDP. And that number is only going to become lower and lower as the needs, as pointed out by the Public Service of the American Society of Civil Engineers keeps growing from $2 trillion to $3 trillion to now $4 trillion. This is a problem that's not going away, and it's only going to get larger.
And so I wanted to share what that means, though. I wanted to just break down those big numbers and share what that actually means for people in their everyday lives. So we got a video comment from a resident of Baltimore. Her name is Kristen Jeffers, and this is what she told us.
I just made Baltimore my home, and yes, I'm in Baltimore, and I can't think of any other example of inequality, especially in minority communities. We're about 60% Black American here, and I'm really enjoying being in a city that's helpful for creatives. However, there are definitely issues, and we all know them. I'm about 10 blocks from where the uprising happened, and again, as you can see, this is a fairly stable neighborhood. It's called Bolton Hill. So, you know, it's what it is, and we should definitely do better, and I think there are a lot of great folks here on the ground who are working to change things in Baltimore.
So Tanvi, she says there are issues in Baltimore that disproportionately affect communities of color. She gives us a tease. She doesn't tell us what the issues are, though. So can you give us an example of what that looks like for someone who might live in a place like Baltimore?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's important is to note how those federal dollars, however they've been shrinking, have translated to local, to cities and states, and how they've been able to use them to build stuff, and where and for whom, right? And those are the questions we need to answer. In Baltimore, for example, there was a transit project that was planned for a really long time, the Red Line project, and it was supposed to serve communities in East and West Baltimore, communities of color who had been waiting for that project for a really long time. That was eventually canceled by the governor, who chose to use the funds that he had available for for funding roads in suburban and rural areas. They now do have a bus system that costs much less, but for the residents of Baltimore, like Kristen, it's very much always been that they're an afterthought when it comes to how those infrastructure funds are allocated on the ground. This is one really good, very recent example of how that's still happening.
Are you aware of that happening, Tom, as the money that you do get to patch up and repair and improve infrastructure? Are you aware that, is it going to the rich neighborhoods rather than the poorer ones?
I think the issue that Tanvi is raising is highlighting the need to invest in infrastructure in general. And when we talk about infrastructure, we talk about sustainable infrastructure, which means, as civil engineers, it means it's environmental, economic, and socially responsible when you're figuring out how to allocate the dollars and how to design, operate, build, maintain, et cetera. So 2.5 million jobs are at stake between now and 2025 by failing to invest in infrastructure. These are things that impact impoverished communities. So if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, look at all the issues facing the planet, civilization, hunger, inequality, poverty. Infrastructure is necessary to address all of that. Transit systems are important. Public transportation is critical to connect impoverished areas with, to bring people out of poverty. So I think that the infrastructure is the solution to these problems, and making sure it's done in a sustainable way that looks at social considerations as well, environmental and economic, absolutely imperative.
John.
Let me throw something in on this as well. I very much agree with everything that people are saying here. Just as we have environmental racism, there's budget racial divisions, and certainly those people who can hire a lobbyist, who can influence the political process, are often likely to be heard and to get resources going to certain areas. And I'll give you a very good example that people don't always discuss when they're talking about infrastructure. It extends the conversation out to an extent. And that is our digital infrastructure. The fact of the matter is that any social scientist will tell you that we are now in a digital age. We're in an age where we work and we communicate often via the internet. And yet there is a huge infrastructure divide as regards the internet. There are some places where, in the United States, where you have terrific internet service and it's building out and getting better and better. But you have rural regions of the United States that are falling further and further behind. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, 20 years ago or 15 years ago, the United States was on the cutting edge of internet build out, at least of imagining it and beginning to make it real. This is a place where many of the great innovations took place. Now, the United States trails more than a dozen countries around the world. In fact, it's far behind countries like South Korea that have made the investments. So when we think about this, yes, we must think about roads and bridges and all the things that we're talking about. But frankly, smart infrastructure development for the 21st century also involves a digital commitment and a commitment to all the structure of that. And that commitment is especially necessary, and frankly, our current circumstance especially troubling as regards urban areas of this country, some of our low-income areas, but also rural low-income areas as well. And so it's a big deal, and it ought to be one where we can build remarkable coalitions. There really can be coalitions around this that go way beyond Democrat and Republican, liberal and conservative.
Let me just go back. Go ahead, Barry, you go first.
I just wanted to round out what John was just talking about on a demographic standpoint. And this is something that is indisputable, but is being widely ignored by our nation's leadership at every level. Between now and the year 2050, just by natural birth growth, our nation is going to add nearly 100 million citizens. They are going to be living largely in the South and Southwest, where the growth of our nation has been going on for the last 40 or 50 years. And they're going to be creating new cities, new urban areas of millions of people that don't exist right now, but are being plotted. And what that means is we're going to not only be dealing with a failing infrastructure, with water pipes that are leaking 10 million gallons a day, 10 billion gallons a day. We're not only going to be dealing with an electric grid, which is not connected on a national basis. We're not going to only be dealing with roads and bridges and dams, which are highly at risk, but we're going to have to build anew accommodations for infrastructure to house and to move around all this new 100 million citizens in our country. Nobody is addressing this. Nobody is recognizing the critical need to not only rebuild 250 billion square feet of built stuff we have in our nation today, but also to build another 250 billion square feet we're going to need in 30 or 40 years.
But what an exciting problem to have. This is a chance for innovation.
Executive Director of the American Society of Civil Engineers. It's like plenty of work for us to do.
Well, I'm just saying we're relying on infrastructure that's centuries old here sometimes, and we've got all this new technology, and you think about autonomous vehicles and linking technology with some of the infrastructure that we have today. I mean, there are sustainable solutions that we haven't even unleashed. And so it really is an exciting opportunity.
Give us one.
Piezoelectric transducers in roads to provide energy just from from pressure. I mean, solar energy, things that are happening with connected and autonomous vehicles. This is really ready to unleash in the United States. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity here, but we have got to really reprioritize what we're doing as a country and stop focusing so much on other things. And I look at just as U.S. citizens and what we pay for Netflix and Starbucks and cable TV and all these things, and then we don't want to pay for water and transportation and sewer, the basic fundamentals of life. Things that we absolutely need just to not only just to live, and you see that when you go through disasters like we had with Hurricane Harvey, et cetera. I mean, it's really, you get back to the basics. And sometimes we have to be, we're really reactive when we get back to the basics. We need to be more proactive and stop doing this only in response to disasters.
So much potential, and yet, even here in the nation's capital, I think our international audience would be surprised. We got a couple of tweets about what it's like to live here. This is Lynch Fraser, who says, try driving in Washington, D.C. The quality of the roads is atrocious, not to mention the failing public rail system. One of our own producers actually sent us a picture of what it looks like outside his apartment. If there's one U.S. city that shouldn't be like this, he would say it's the capital. But what to do about it is a bigger question. This is what Sarah says. I don't see a problem in letting private companies develop infrastructure as long as there's government oversight to ensure standards are met. However, we wouldn't need as much private investment if most of our taxes weren't going to U.S. military and defense. Tanvi, do you want to take this one on? Private companies coming in to do what the government may not be able to or won't do?
I think that's been a critique of at least the plan that's been put out by the Trump administration so far. One of the critiques that I've seen is that there's a heavy emphasis on private investment in sort of carrying the burden of new infrastructure development, and that is going to lead to, I guess, a prioritization of the projects that make money. Right? And so you have your big airports that are like really glitzy, like sexy projects, right? Big roads, toll roads that can generate fees through user fees, but not so much your broken sidewalks that are less known, less like less sort of advertisable projects, right? So that's been one of the critiques that's come out after, and perhaps my colleagues can comment a little bit more on that.
Let me jump in here and offer a notion on one thing. It's very, very important that the federal government remain highly engaged with this. It doesn't mean that some things won't be done by the private sector, but as has been suggested, priorities matter. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the private sector has been very involved with our digital build-out, and rural areas have been left behind. It is simply the reality. There are urban areas that have been left behind. And so you want a government that's highly engaged, that has a real role in this. And I'll give you an example of where a problem arises, or where it appears to be arising. Following the flooding in Houston, we became aware of incredible vulnerabilities in the infrastructure. There's no doubt that there will be a lot of infrastructure construction in the Houston area and in other areas that have been hit by these superstorms. And yet, less than 2 weeks before the Hurricane Harvey hit, the Trump administration reversed an Obama administration rule called the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard that required that U.S. money going to new infrastructure be put into projects only that would be climate resilient, i.e. projects that were prepared to deal with the realities of the 21st century in not just climate change, but the storm surges, the flooding, and other things that may be related to it. And so it's not just that the federal government should be involved, but the federal government also has to be involved in an enlightened way, in a way that gets this.
John, I have a theory. John and Barry and Tanvi and Tom, I have a theory that there's so much involved with caring about your infrastructure that the public actually find it overwhelming. Politicians also find it overwhelming. There was one person and one team and a show that felt that they could tackle this. Bizarrely enough, it was a comedy show, and it's a comedian called John Oliver. Have a look at his take on why we're not doing more.
The lack of political urgency in tackling this problem is insane. And you cannot tell me that you are not interested in this, because every summer people flock to see our infrastructure threatened by terrorists or aliens. But we should care just as much when it's under threat from the inevitable passage of time.
In a world where a few feet of concrete can mean the difference between life and death, where everything you love can be taken from you in the blink of an eye, a few brave souls are willing to risk everything to make nothing happen.
Hello?
It's time.
Excuse me?
For your biennial bridge inspection.
Jesus God, Bobby. Behind you. Seepage. This thing is going to blow. 15 or 20 years, which is why it's so important that we caught it early.
It's to be able to spot that little leak and be able to predict that if we don't plug it now, we could have a blockbuster on our hands. I love that because it really summed up even the issue about how do we talk about this on a discussion show and keep people engaged. I have to say thank you. Congratulations, John and Barry, Tanvi and Tom. You absolutely did that. Malika.
I'll end with Messy Kennedy on Twitter, who says, we need to make Congress realize how serious of an issue this is, especially, they think, in rural America, where a lot of the food and manufacturing is. So thanks to our community for being part of this conversation.
A couple of places to share with you. www.infrastructurereportcard.org. Tom will be very happy if you see that. And then also take a look at this if you're ever in the US, saveourbridges.com. You probably never want to go across another bridge, certainly without checking first. Our infrastructure continues online. #AJStream. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you next time.